The bedroom was too warm for October, and that was the first thing that felt wrong. I stood in the doorway of Harold's room at 7 in the morning, watching the curtains sway slightly from a heating vent that had no business running in fall weather, and I thought to myself, someone turned that up. Someone who knew an old man with a weakened heart struggles more when the room is too warm. Someone who wanted him tired. I had been a registered nurse for 31 years before my knees and my lower back told me it was time to stop. I knew what exhaustion looked like on a sick body, and I knew the difference between a man declining naturally and a man being helped toward his end. But I am getting ahead of myself. That is a habit I developed late in life, starting at the middle of things. My daughter used to tease me about it at dinner. My name is Margaret. I am 62 years old. I lived, before all of this in a small house in Tucson, Arizona, the one my late husband Raymond and I bought in 1987, when the neighborhood was still quiet and the Palo Verde trees in the yard were barely taller than our daughter. Raymond passed 8 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I held his hand through every one of those 77 days, and I thought, when it was over, that I understood grief completely. I did not. Grief keeps teaching you. My daughter Claire is 34. She is bright and kind and stubborn in the best possible way, and 2 years ago she was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition that required a specialist in Philadelphia, treatments not covered by her insurance, and money I simply did not have. I had my pension, my social security, and a savings account that looked respectable until I started writing checks to medical offices, and it began to shrink the way ice does in a glass slowly. Then suddenly, I was not desperate. I want to be clear about that. Desperate people make rash decisions, and what I made was a calculated one. There is a difference. The arrangement came through a family attorney named Louis Graff, who had been recommended by a colleague of mine from the hospital. Louis represented a man named Harold Whitmore, 74 years old, retired founder of a regional construction company that had made him, over 40 years of work, quite wealthy. Harold had been diagnosed with congestive heart failure 18 months earlier. His doctors had given him a generous estimate of 8 to 12 months, though they acknowledged that with proper care and medication management, some patients exceeded those expectations considerably. Harold wanted a companion, a medical caregiver who would also serve as his wife on paper, for reasons that were, Louis explained carefully, related to an estate restructuring that Harold's accountant had recommended. The arrangement would be legal, transparent, and time-limited. Harold was clear-eyed about his prognosis, and clear-eyed about what he needed. He was not looking for love. He was looking for someone qualified to manage his medical care in his own home, someone who would be present, and someone who would be compensated fairly. The compensation was fair. More than fair. It would cover Claire's treatments and leave enough remaining that I would not have to worry about my own roof for some years to come. I met Harold on a Tuesday afternoon in September. He was sitting in a leather chair by a window in his study, thinner than I had expected from the photograph Louis had shown me, with white hair and dark eyes and the particular stillness that people develop when they have made their peace with something large. He shook my hand. His grip was stronger than I expected. He asked me 3 questions: whether I was comfortable with end-of-life care, whether I had personal experience with loss, and whether I was honest. I said yes to all 3. He said, "Good. Those are the only things I actually need." We were married 6 weeks later, in a small ceremony at the county clerk's office. Louis attended. Harold's housekeeper, a woman named Rosa, who had worked for him for 11 years, stood as witness. Harold wore a blue tie. I wore a grey dress I had bought at a department store the week before. We did not exchange personal vows. We shook hands again after the clerk finished, and Harold said, "Thank you, Margaret," with the same quiet formality he brought to everything, and I thought, this is a business arrangement between 2 adults who understand each other, and there is dignity in that. Harold's house was a large adobe-style property in the foothills north of the city, the kind of place with terracotta floors and high ceilings, and a courtyard with a fountain that ran day and night. It had 4 bedrooms. I took the one across the hall from Harold's so I could hear him if he needed me in the night. Rosa came 3 days a week for cleaning and cooking. The rest of the time, it was Harold and me and the fountain in the courtyard. He was a better conversationalist than I had expected. He had opinions about history and architecture, and a dry sense of humour that surprised me the first time it surfaced. He asked about my nursing career with genuine curiosity. He asked about Claire, and when I explained her condition, he listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it should be. In the evenings, we sometimes sat in the courtyard, and he would tell me about the early years of his company, about building subdivisions in the desert before anyone thought the desert was worth building in. I administered his medications every morning and evening. I monitored his vitals. I kept detailed notes, because that is what 31 years of nursing teaches you: document everything, always, because memory is unreliable and records are not. Harold had 2 children from his first marriage. His son, Dennis, was 46 years old and lived in Scottsdale with his wife, Pamela. His daughter, Renee, was 43 and lived in Denver. I was introduced to both of them within my first 2 weeks in the house. Dennis arrived on a Wednesday, unannounced, while Harold was resting. He walked through the front door, which Rosa had answered, and looked at me in the kitchen the way a person looks at an object that has been moved to the wrong shelf. He was tall, well-dressed, with Harold's dark eyes and none of Harold's warmth. "You must be the nurse," he said. "I am Harold's wife," I said pleasantly. "Can I get you something to drink?" He did not want something to drink. He wanted to speak to his father. And when he did, I heard raised voices through the study door. Not the words, but the shape of them, Dennis's voice rising and Harold staying level, deliberate, the way it always was. When Dennis left 40 minutes later, he walked past me in the hallway without looking at me. Renee was warmer on the surface. She called the following weekend, and when she visited the month after, she brought flowers and a casserole dish, and kissed her father on the cheek and smiled at me with the specific brightness of a person performing warmth rather than feeling it. She asked me questions about my background that were framed as friendliness but were structured as audits. Where was I from? What had I done before this? Did I have family in Tucson? Did I know Harold's attorney well? I answered everything honestly, with the same pleasant tone I used on difficult patients. And I watched. I watched because I was a nurse for 31 years, and watching is what nurses do. In Harold's 3rd week under my care, I noticed that he seemed more fatigued than his condition alone would explain. His resting heart rate, which I had established a baseline for in the 1st week, was running slightly elevated. Not alarmingly, just enough that a person who was not paying close attention would miss it. His colour was slightly off in the mornings. He complained twice of feeling nauseated after his evening medications, which he had not mentioned in the 1st weeks. I said nothing to anyone. I simply began photographing his medication bottles every morning before I administered his doses, the label, the fill level, the pill count, and logging the images with timestamps on my phone. This is what I mean when I say I was not passive. I had been a nurse. I knew that when something feels clinically wrong, you do not confront, you document. Confrontation without evidence accomplishes nothing except alerting the problem that it has been noticed. On a Thursday evening in November, Dennis and Pamela came for dinner. Rosa had prepared the meal. After dinner, Harold tired quickly, more quickly than usual, and excused himself to rest. I helped him to his room, settled him, checked his vitals, and noted that his blood pressure was lower than it had been that morning. Not dangerously, but lower. When I came back down the hallway, I saw Pamela coming out of the bathroom near Harold's study, carrying her handbag. She did not see me immediately. She adjusted something inside the bag, closed it, and looked up. For 1 second, before the smile arrived on her face, there was something else in her expression. Not guilt exactly. More like the recalibration of someone who has been startled. "Everything all right with Harold?" she asked. "He's resting comfortably," I said. I went to bed that night and lay awake thinking about that 1-second expression, and about blood pressure numbers, and about a medication bottle that had been, I checked my photographs, 3 pills short of where it should have been at that point in the refill cycle. 3 pills in 4 days. Not dramatic, not enough to point at, enough to matter. The next morning, I called Lewis Graff. I did not call to accuse anyone. I called because I was Harold's caretaker, and his wife and I had a concern about his medication management that I wanted documented by his attorney before I took any further steps. Lewis was quiet while I spoke. When I finished, he said he appreciated the call and asked me to continue logging what I was observing and to contact him again if anything escalated. I asked him whether Harold had a separate physician I could consult independently, someone not referred through the family. Lewis gave me a name. Dr. Susan Farrell, a cardiologist at the university hospital who had seen Harold once before. Dennis had pushed for a doctor closer to home. I made an appointment for the following week. In the meantime, I did something that took me 3 days to work up to. Harold's evening medications came from a bottle in the bedside cabinet. I had been the one managing them since my arrival, but I had seen Pamela near that cabinet area during a previous visit, and I had been watching the count. I took 2 of the pills, replacements I had held aside from the previous refill, which I still had because I had kept the old bottle as I always did, and I placed them in a small sealed bag and labelled them with the date. I sent them, along with a note, to a pharmacology lab I had used during a research project at the hospital years ago. I paid for the analysis myself. I also began making small, documented changes. I told Harold that I was adjusting the timing of one of his evening medications based on his recent blood pressure readings, which was clinically reasonable. This meant I was now present for every single dose, watching it administered, nothing passing through my hands that I had not personally accounted for. Harold looked at me one morning over his coffee and said, "You're being very careful lately." "I am always careful," I said. He looked at me for a moment with those dark eyes. "You're being more careful than usual," he said. "Is there something I should know?" I thought about how to answer. I had not wanted to worry him, but Harold was not a man who handled being managed well, and I had come to respect him enough not to try. "I have some questions about your medication levels," I said. "I've consulted with a cardiologist and I'm waiting on some additional information. When I know something definitive, I will tell you everything I know. I want to be clear about that." He was quiet. Then he said, "All right," and he drank his coffee. That was what I valued most about Harold Whitmore. He did not fill silences unnecessarily. The lab results came back on a Tuesday, 12 days after I sent the samples. I was sitting at the kitchen table when the email arrived. I read it twice, then printed it, then sat very still for approximately 4 minutes. One of the medications a blood thinner Harold was prescribed at a specific therapeutic dose had been replaced. What I had sent to the lab was not the prescribed medication. It was a visually similar tablet, with a significantly different composition, one that would, over time and at the levels being administered, cause the exact symptoms I had been observing: fatigue, nausea, blood pressure, irregularity, a gradual weakening that would read, to anyone who was not paying close attention, as natural disease progression. I called Louis Graff that afternoon. I sent him the lab report by email while we were on the phone. He was quiet for a long time after I finished speaking. Then he said, "Margaret, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not confront anyone. Do not change anything in your routine that would signal you know what you know. I am going to make some calls today. I've already secured the evidence," I said. "I have photographs, dated logs, the lab report, and the retained original sample." Another pause. "You've been doing this for how long?" "Since the 3rd week," I said. He exhaled. "All right. I'll be in touch by end of week." The next 10 days were the most difficult of my life since Raymond's illness, and what made them difficult was not fear, though I would be lying if I said I felt none, but the necessity of behaving normally while knowing what I knew. Cooking breakfast, monitoring vitals, sitting in the courtyard in the evenings while the fountain ran, and Harold told me about a job site he had managed in 1978, a mall project in Mesa that had gone over budget 4 times and been worth it anyway because he had been proud of the finished building. He was, I realized during those 10 days, a genuinely good man. He had built something real over his working life. He had raised 2 children after their mother left when they were young, which he mentioned only once and without bitterness. He sent money to a food bank in his neighborhood every month, not as a tax strategy but because Rosa had mentioned once that they were struggling. He was not sentimental, but he was kind, in the specific way of people who believe actions matter more than words. I thought about Dennis and Pamela, who stood to inherit a significant estate. I thought about Renee, who was either involved or oblivious, and I did not yet know which. I thought about the heating vent in Harold's room that ran in October. I thought about Pamela's hand adjusting something in her bag in the hallway. And I thought about how much I wanted Harold Whitmore to live. That surprised me. Not because caring about a patient is unusual, I had cared about every patient I had ever had, but because this was different. This was personal. Somewhere in the evenings, in the courtyard, in the quiet conversations and the coffee and the dry observations about history and the way he said thank you as though he actually meant it, I had stopped thinking of Harold as an arrangement. Louis called on a Friday morning when Harold was doing his physical therapy exercises in the study. "I've been in contact with a detective in the white-collar crimes unit," he said. They want to move carefully because of the medical evidence involved. They'll need your full cooperation, which means maintaining normal routine until they're ready. How long? A week, possibly 2. Can you do that? I've been doing it for 3 weeks already, I said. That weekend, Dennis and Pamela visited again. I served coffee. I asked Pamela about a home renovation project she had mentioned on the previous visit, because people who are doing something wrong become more comfortable when they believe they are invisible, and I needed her comfortable. She talked about countertops for 20 minutes. I listened attentively. After they left, Harold found me in the kitchen and sat down across the table from me. I know you know something, he said. I want you to tell me. I had been preparing for this moment. I had decided, after a great deal of thought, that Harold had the right to know what was happening in his own home, and that treating him as someone who needed protection from the truth was a form of disrespect he did not deserve. I sat down. I told him everything, starting with the heating vent in October and ending with the lab report and my conversation with Lewis. I showed him the photographs on my phone, the dated logs, the printed lab results. He did not interrupt me once. When I finished, the kitchen was very quiet except for the fountain in the courtyard, which you could hear through the window if it was silent enough. Harold looked at the lab report for a long time. Then he set it on the table and folded his hands and looked at the courtyard. My son, he said, finally. It was not a question. It was a recognition. The particular grief of a parent who has suspected something and now knows it. I believe Pamela was the one physically handling the medication, I said carefully. Lewis and the detective will determine the full extent. Harold nodded. He did not cry. His jaw tightened, and then released. And then he said, You protected me. Yes, I said. Why? He looked at me directly. You could have documented it, reported it, stepped back. You didn't have to stay present the way you did. You didn't have to do any of the work you did. I thought about how to answer that honestly. In the beginning, I said, it was professional. I was your caregiver and something was wrong with your medical care, but somewhere in the middle of it, that stopped being the reason. He looked at me for a moment. No, he said quietly. It stopped being the only reason. The detective and 2 officers came on a Thursday morning when Dennis and Pamela were at the house at my quiet coordination with Lewis, who had suggested Harold invite his son for a conversation about the estate. I was in the kitchen when I heard the front door. I heard Lewis's voice, and another voice I did not recognize, and then Dennis's voice, rising. I stayed in the kitchen. I had done what I needed to do. Pamela's bag, examined with a warrant that had been prepared in advance, contained a small container of medication that matched the tablets from the lab analysis. Her phone, accessed with a second warrant, contained messages with Dennis that Lewis later told me were, in his words, more than sufficient. Renee, it turned out, had known nothing. She arrived 2 days later from Denver, white-faced and silent, and sat with her father in the study for 3 hours. When she came out, she found me in the courtyard and said, simply, "Thank you." I told her there was nothing to thank me for, which was not entirely true but seemed like the right thing to say. The medication situation, once I was able to implement the correct prescriptions under Dr. Farrell's oversight, began to reverse within 2 weeks. Harold's blood pressure stabilized, his color improved. The fatigue that had been sitting on him like a second weight began to lift incrementally. The way weather changes, you don't see the moment it shifts, but one day you look up and the light is different. His underlying heart condition remained. He was not cured. 8 to 12 months had become a less certain prediction now that he was actually receiving what his body needed, and Dr. Farrell was cautiously optimistic about a longer timeline. But Harold was a man who had made his peace with his prognosis and did not require false reassurance. He did not require it from me either. That was one of the things I had come to love about him. It took me a moment, sitting with that word in my mind, to accept that it was accurate. On a Wednesday evening in January, 3 months after the arrests, Harold and I were in the courtyard after dinner. The desert winter was cold enough for jackets, and the fountain was quieter in the chill, as though it too was conserving energy. Harold was reading. I was doing nothing in particular, which is something I had gradually learned to do in the evenings in that courtyard, and which I had not been able to do for a very long time before that. Harold set down his book and looked at the fountain for a moment. "I want to revise our arrangement," he said. "All right," I said. "The financial component stands," he said. I've spoken with Lewis about ensuring that Claire's treatments are fully covered regardless of any other considerations, and that is not subject to revision. That's separate. Harold, let me finish. He turned to look at me. In the low light of the courtyard, his face was still, and his eyes were the same as they had been the day I met him, direct, unhurried. What I want to revise is the framing. I would prefer that this not be an arrangement. I am aware that I am 74 years old, and that my prognosis is what it is, and I am not asking you to pretend any of that is different. But I would like, for whatever time there is, to not be an arrangement. I thought about Raymond, who I had loved for 31 years, and whose absence was still, after 8 years, a specific shape in my life. I thought about the woman I had been when I drove to that first meeting with Louis Graff, calculating what I was willing to do and what I expected nothing from. I think, I said slowly, that it stopped being an arrangement some time ago. I just hadn't said it out loud. Harold nodded once, the way he nodded at things that made sense to him. Good, he said. And he picked up his book again. Dennis was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and financial elder abuse. Pamela faced additional charges related to the medication tampering. Lewis told me the case was strong and that the prosecution was confident. I did not attend the hearings. I was busy, those months, managing Harold's care, corresponding with Dr. Farrell, making a trip to Philadelphia with Harold, his first time flying in 3 years, to meet Claire, who sat across a restaurant table from him and studied his face the way she had always studied people, and then smiled at him and said, "Mum talks about you like you're a reasonable person. That's a high bar in our family." Harold said, "I'll do my best to maintain it." And I thought, yes, that is exactly right. There are things you understand about yourself at 62 that you could not have understood at 32. You understand that strength is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act clearly despite it. You understand that love, the second time, arrives differently, not as fire but as light, the kind that is already in the room when you open your eyes in the morning. You understand that the arrangements we make to survive sometimes become the truest things in our lives, if we are honest enough to let them. I had been a nurse for 31 years. I had held the hands of people at the end of things and helped them through the last passages of their lives with as much dignity and care as I could provide. I thought I knew what that work asked of me. I did not know, until Harold, that it could also ask me to begin again. The fountain still runs in the courtyard. The Palo Verde in the yard, Harold has one too. Older than mine, drops its small leaves in the spring and comes back every summer without being asked, which is a kind of faithfulness I have come to admire in desert plants. Harold reads in the evenings. I sit with him, or nearby, or across the courtyard with my own book and my own quiet. Claire is in remission as of 6 weeks ago. Her doctor used the word encouraging, which in medicine is as close to joy as the language allows. I called Lewis the day we got the news. He said, "Margaret, I've been a family attorney for 28 years. I've seen arrangements like yours go 100 different directions. I want you to know this one was the best outcome I have witnessed in a long time." I thanked him. Then I went to the courtyard and told Harold. He set down his book. He looked at me with those dark, unhurried eyes. And he said, "Good. That's very good, Margaret." It was everything.